Morning, everyone. Good try. Our speaker this morning has a day job as an associate professor of social sciences at Boston University's College of General Studies. There he teaches and talks politics, with basketball as a secondary passion. The two are more or less equal to him, and on occasion they even collide in serendipitous ways. Tom Whalen's fascination with and passion for the Boston Celtics began in the early 1980s when he was a rookie sports writer for his high school newspaper. He'd managed to finagle a press pass to a home game at the old Boston Garden, and before he knew what was happening, the teenager was standing next to the 10 foot, 6 foot 10, it sometimes probably seemed 10 foot, next to the 6 foot 10 future Hall of Famer Larry Bird. The brief interview he scores with Celtics legend Bird began a lifelong love affair with the franchise that has resulted in his latest book, Dynasty Restored: How Larry Bird and the 1984 Boston Celtics Conquered the NBA and Changed Basketball. Thomas explores this fascinating and dramatic season. The NBA has been struggling, seen as a minor sports league and suffering from poor attendance, lagging television ratings, and embarrassing drug scandals. The Celtics were beset by locker room turmoil, disruptive coaching, ownership changes, and underperforming stars. But Tom reveals how that has changed when Bird and his fellow Big Three front courtmen teammates with Kevin McHale and Robert Parish, along with newcomer Dennis Johnson, banded together to lift the venerable franchise to its 15th World Championship and help to transform the league into a global entertainment brand. Dynasty Restored offers insight into the personal barriers Larry Bird had to overcome to achieve NBA stardom, discusses the personal tensions that existed on the team between Bird and McHale, and gives a probing analysis of the unique pressures Black Celtics players faced in a post-Boston busing crisis environment. And it shows how this singular season turbocharged the Celtics and the professional game to unprecedented heights. Please give a warm brotherhood welcome to Tom Whalen.
Delighted to be here. Well, I just wanted to start the talk to kind of lay down a kind of a historic context for events here. What was going on in 1984, if you can look back to those years. In 1984, of course, well, we were right in the middle of the Reagan era. Ronald Reagan had just been reelected to a second term in a landslide. Michael Jackson, well, he was the pop king ruling the airwaves and this newfangled medium called MTV. And Thriller became at the time, the all-time leading selling album. And at the movies, at the turnstiles, people were flocking to see this strange mixture of supernatural and comedy called Ghostbusters, starring former Saturday Night Live stars such as Dan Aykroyd. And, well, you know Mr. Bill Murray. He's been quite busy over the last 20 years. And on television, there was a debut of two new shows. The first, a pre-sex scandal, Big Bill Cosby, and it soared to the top of the ratings. And also Miami Vice, about two very, let's just say, colorful undercover drug cops in Miami. And that also soared to the very top, but also created, among other things, led to the fashion of the 1980s with, these scrunched up shoulders and the sockless look. But probably the biggest change, we didn't see it at the time, but it has certainly affected all of our lives, was the introduction of the MacBook, Apple. And who can forget the famous commercial that started it all? It was during the Super Bowl that year. And it was 60 seconds long. That's all it was. But we see at the top of the commercial this young woman in red track shorts. And she's carrying what looks like to be a sledgehammer, running through this dystopian landscape. and she comes across this theater where there's like these kind of gray drones. It was directly out of the pages of 1984 by George Orwell, it seemed. And on the screen, in front of her was this big brother-like figure. And what does she do? Well, she throws the hammer at him. And it leads to this, an explosion of white light. And then you're thinking, I thought this was the Super Bowl. What the heck is this all about? And then this message goes on the screen. On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. And this was the genius of Steve Jobs, the late, great Steve Jobs, and his idea of promotion. And basically, this only ran once during the Super Bowl. They had a very limited marketing budget, but Mac sales skyrocketed, and it changed how we approached everyday life and work moving forward. This is the dawn of the personal computer. This is what made it popular. Now, in terms of sports, 1984 was huge. This was the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. And of course, Carl Lewis was the big gold medal winner that year. He dominated the track field. And Mary Lou Retton dominated gymnastics as a gold medalist. But the biggest talk, and this was the longest legacy resulting, was that you had a very young Michael Jordan show his stuff as on the Olympic basketball team. And he had just been drafted by the Chicago Bulls in the NBA draft just prior to the opening of the Olympics. And great things were expected, and he fulfilled every one of those expectations and then some moving forward. And on the baseball field, well, Chicago Cubs, despite its long, long history of losing, finally won something. They won a division title. But being the Cubs, they blew it in the National League Championship Series. And in hockey, well, we had the great one. Wayne Gretzky wins his first Stanley Cup with the Edmonton Oilers. But in terms of the NBA, well, the NBA was something else. The NBA was the sick man of professional sports. Everything seemed to be going against it. And there was talk that the league probably wouldn't last more than another 5 years or even less. Most of the teams in the NBA were losing money, a lot of money. And a lot of that had to do in terms of what happened in the late 70s, how the league seemed to just implode on itself. Violence, fights were breaking out all the time in basketball games. It looked like it was the WWF many occasions. And there were lots of drugs. And some of the game's leading stars, unfortunately, fell into that trap of addiction, and including this fellow, Spencer Haywood of the then Seattle Supersonics. And Bill Russell, who was the great Celtic who is now coaching the Supersonics that year, he made the joke, so much coke is being snorted in the NBA that if 10 players sneezed at once, you could bet one of them was losing money. He probably wasn't that far off. But there was a new commissioner, new sheriff in town in the NBA, a lawyer by the name of David Stern. And here he is with a mustache before he shaved it off. He looked much better without the mustache, frankly. But Stern, from the get-go, had a vision, a plan to deliver the NBA to big-time status. He thought it could surpass Major League Baseball and a few of the other sports. And so he saw it not necessarily as just kind of a professional sport. He saw it in global terms. And he's really the first one. He was the visionary that changed everything. And as he saw it, the NBA should become, well, like the company this little guy represented. It should be the Disney of the sports world. They have theme parks, he said, referring to Disney, and we have theme parks, only we call them arenas. And he saw the NBA making a mark not just in the United States, but the entire world. He said, we have a good game and we're going to sell it. We're going to market it. You watch. And so he was as good as his word. As we know, the NBA now is probably the most popular global sport next to soccer. And where does Larry Bird and the Celtics fit into all this? Well, in order to market this new vision, to sell this new vision, you needed content. And Larry Bird and the 1984 Celtics provided a lot of content, a lot of drama that really helped sell the league, put it basically on the launch pad, the liftoff, because the 1984 finals against the Los Angeles Lakers would at last cement the NBA as a big-time league. And we'll talk about that towards the end. But the Celtics had an interesting history. They were founded in 1946, one of the charter members of the National Basketball Association, and they established a dominant role in the new league. They were a dynasty, winning at one point from 1957 to 1969, 11 of 13 championships. And it was led by the great Bill Russell, center from the University of San Francisco. And here he is fending off his arch rival, Wilt Chamberlain, of the then Philadelphia 76ers. And when Russell retired, the torch was passed on to a new generation of Celts, led by another center, although a little less dominant, Dave Cowens, who won 2 championships in the 70s. But by the end of the 1970s, things began to go off the rails. The Celtics kind of, I guess, gave in to gravity, and they finished at the bottom of the league standings. And look at this picture. And they, this is before a pretty much empty Boston Garden. Although I should note, they didn't even draw too well, even when they had a dynastic team. And this, of course, was Marvin Bad News Barnes, who was kind of symptomatic of those bad Celtics teams. He gained notoriety for being, as far as I know, the only Celtic to, in the middle of a game, decided to snort cocaine on the bench. And he was alarmed when his nose started to bleed and was bleeding on the garden parquet. He didn't last very long. But things began to pick up when the Celtics drafted Larry Bird as their number 1 selection. And Red Auerbach, the general manager and really the godfather of the Celtics organization, he drafted him, which was unheard of at the time, as a junior. Bird played out his senior year, but he joined the team starting in 1979. And here he is the day he was introduced to the Boston Press Corps. Now, Bird had, you could almost say, a tragic upbringing. He comes from Indiana, dirt poor. His father was, he was a veteran of the Korean War. Apparently, he had some very bad experiences during the war, and he had some substance abuse problems. And they were very impoverished. They would move around from one house to another, one community to the other. They eventually settled down in kind of French Lick. And Larry Bird never forgot being poor. And to this day, he's considered one of the more wealthier NBA former players, but he doesn't like to spend much money, shall we say. And here he is in high school, and he soon discovered, what a dominant talent he had. And not only was he good at scoring, but he had this uncanny ability to find his fellow teammates. He was this acrobatic passer. And these skills would do him well moving forward in his career. And he was a great Indiana high school basketball player, but because he played for French Lick, it was a small town, small area. He didn't get the notice perhaps that he should have for, big time college recruiters. But Bobby Knight, the controversial coach of Indiana University, who had won national championships, he decided to recruit him and sign him. And here they are, and not exactly happy marriage here, basketball-wise. Bird lasted less than a month under the authoritarian ways of Bobby Knight. And Bird, well, he was humiliated by the experience. And his mother, Bird's mother, later said this was probably kind of fortune shining on her son. She said Bobby Knight might have put him in a slot and not given him the freedom he needed on the court. Because Bobby Knight had a very set way of doing things, ran a patterned offense, and Bird was all about improvisation, creativity. And maybe, just maybe, if Bird had stuck it out at Indiana, we might not have kind of the Bird that we ended up having. You know, a effervescent NBA forward, you know, one of the cornerstone stars of the 1980s. So what does he do? He drops out of Indiana after, you know, basically less than a month. He goes home and works on a garbage truck. And people were whispering behind his back, you know, saying, loser, loser. And he, being Bird, took it. But he made sure that, you know, he would take stock, that, you know, he would remember what they said about him. And when he did achieve stardom, he would never talk to them again. But he ended up at the kind of lesser known Indiana State and became one of college basketball players' most dominant players at the end of the 1970s. In his senior year, he made it all the way to the NCAA championship game, where he squared off against what was going to be a very common encounter in the years ahead, Magic Johnson, who played for Michigan State. And this was the kind of the first epic showdown between these two great basketball stars. Johnson was a effervescent point guard and just as good as Bird, if not better, probably was better. I don't think there's a question about that. And Johnson, in this first encounter, defeated Bird. It wasn't really that close. Bird was really the only good player, or great player, I should say, on Indiana State. The rest were kind of complementary pieces, and Indiana State easily fell to Michigan State. But when he gets to the pros, Larry Bird surprises everyone. Everyone thought he was a good college player, but they had no idea. Even Red Auerbach admitted that, just how good he could be. He became Rookie of the Year, scored over 20 points, and tore down over 10 rebounds a game as a rookie. And, you know, you have to remember, too, he was going against Magic Johnson, who was also starting out in the NBA that year. So pretty stiff competition, but he wins Rookie of the Year. And the Celtics, who had been bottom feeders the last couple of seasons, suddenly vaulted to the top of their division. The greatest turnaround in NBA history in terms of wins. I think it was like something like 30 or 40 wins additionally, with Bird now leading the way. And a year later, his second season, Bird is able to take the Celtics all the way to the NBA championship. Now, Auerbach here, as I said, the godfather of the Celtics. He was the one who had the foresight to draft Bird early as a junior. And he also was the genius behind the trade that would bring about what we would consider the great Celtics teams of the 1980s, because that 81 championship would not have been achieved unless Auerbach pulled off what was probably the greatest steal in Boston history since the Brinks job. And that's because the Celtics, because of how bad they were previously, held the number one pick in the NBA draft. So he decided to trade it. And he traded it. It ended up being Joe Barry Carroll, who was a pretty good NBA player, but nothing compared to the Hall of Fame talent Auerbach was able to get in return. Namely, he traded down, he got a number 3 pick, which ended up being Kevin McHale, one of the greatest forwards all time. And he also was able to pick up, at the time, an underachieving center with the Golden State Warriors, because that's who he traded with, named Robert Parish. So they joined Bird, and together they became known as the Big Three. And Celtics history would never be the same. But again, it was the genius of Red Auerbach that put this together. And, he did this frequently throughout his career. He was the genius that figured out the importance of Bill Russell when a lot of teams were willing to pass him by. And Russell just created a dynasty for the Celtics. And so one championship won with that Big Three when they're first together that first season. And the Garden, which had been, pretty much a cavern, and I should say the old Boston Garden, as you can tell from this photograph, they were packing the joint, sellout crowds. And that had never been the case, even when they were winning championship after championship in the late 50s and 1960s. And the Celtics, in many ways, they showed a change, right? Boston was suffering some serious wounds from the 1970s, particularly the busing crisis, the federal court-ordered busing, which ripped communities apart, black and white in Boston. And there was a high level of violence everywhere. And these are some common pictures at the time. Boston's still licking its wounds from that period. And of course, in the middle of this, we had this Pulitzer Prize winning photograph from a Boston Herald photographer. And this was a lawyer, Ted Lansmark, later became a president of the Boston Architectural College. And he was just strolling to get to an appointment in Government Center Plaza. And some high school students from Charlestown who were protesting busing, wielded a flag and tried to spear him with it. He was lucky to escape with his life. This photograph was called The Soiling of Old Glory. And you can see that how, dramatic this was. This was broadcast all around the country. And it's forever soiled Boston's reputation as being a less than liberal town, as it would, at least it likes to think it is. It's really considered a racist town even to this day. And Bill Russell, well, at the time, certainly, he would not disagree with this image. Now, despite winning 11 of 13, 11 championships, he had been a two-time college champion, and he won an Olympic gold medal in Melbourne. He said this about Boston in the 70s. Paul Revere were writing today, it would be for racism. The ends are coming, the ends are coming. And he once said that he'd rather be a lamppost in Seattle than mayor of Boston. And he had a personal grudge. He was living north of Boston in Reading, the town of Reading. And one time, someone broke into his house, broke his trophies, smeared feces on the wall, and defecated in his bed. And on the wall, they spray painted the N-word. And he didn't complain about it. He just, took note of it. But it kind of seared inside of him, just the kind of the racial intolerance. The reason that prompted it, he felt, was because he wanted to move to a more affluent white community. And apparently he was not welcome there. He went there anyway, because that was Bill Russell. Casey Jones, who I believe lived in this area, I've been told, he had his own problems. When he first moved here, a cross was burned on his lawn, sending, a very chilling message. Satch Sanders, Hall of Fame forward, defensive forward, played for NYU in college. He had his own problems. He said, he was trying to get, an apartment in the Back Bay, and real estate agents would not even touch him. And he said, it was very hard getting a cab if you were in Roxbury or any of the black sections in town. You wouldn't be picked up if you were of a certain skin color. This wasn't just among the Celtics. Other professional athletes, such as Reggie Smith, center fielder, a really good center fielder, all-star center fielder with the Boston Red Sox, he had numerous problems with the fans. They would yell all sorts of racial epithets at Fenway Park, not exactly the most welcoming of places for athletes of color, even to this day. And, there was the overwhelming factor here of Tom Yawkey, probably the most racist owner in baseball history. And I don't say that lightly because Mr. Yawkey, as he was called, had first dibs on Jackie Robinson and Willie Mays. Can you imagine if they had him and if they played, alongside Ted Williams? There would have been no talk of the curse of the Bambino. But because of their skin color, Yawkey passed on them. And the ironic thing is, the Boston Bruins integrated before the Boston Red Sox with Willie O'Ree in the mid-1950s. They finally signed a black ball player, brought him up to the big leagues in 1959 on the eve of the Kennedy administration, the last team in the major leagues to do so. Well, Red Auerbach and the Boston Celtics were not the Boston Red Sox. And they were pioneers when it came to integration in the league. They signed Chuck Cooper. He broke the NBA color line. They drafted him in 1950. And when the Celtics owner, then Walter Brown, said, well, this guy is black, he said, I don't care if he's pink or blue. We're going to sign him. And Red Auerbach was enthusiastically behind this. And the team here, also in the 60s, became the first team to field on the floor 5 starting African-American athletes. And Auerbach made a point that when he stepped down from coaching after the 1966 season, that he wanted Bill Russell to succeed him. Bill Russell became the first black coach of any major leagues to be appointed to that position. And he promptly won 2 championships in 3 seasons. And I should say, Auerbach was especially attuned to the problems that athletes of color had here in Boston. Because he said growing up in New York, he grew up in Brooklyn, he faced, let's just say, a lot of anti-Semitism. So he had a lot of sympathy for the athletes of color and what they went through. And he was not a Boston resident. He spent most of his time, Mr. Auerbach did, in Washington, D.C., his hometown. Which brings us back to Larry Bird. And with now a white superstar, a certifiable white superstar, the Celtics now suddenly capture the imagination of Boston. And cynics said, well, there's a surprise. If he was black, the Celtics never would have had their revival in terms of fan interest. But whether it's true or not, Bird made a difference when it came to tickets being sold. Prior to the 1984 season, it was pretty tumultuous. They missed out on going to the finals in 1982. They lost in the Eastern Conference Finals. And in 1983, they had problems with their coach, who had basically led them to the 81 championship, Bill Fitch, who was a Mandarin authoritarian type. That's all right when you have a young team, but now the Celtics had a couple of years under their belt. They were more veterans, and they didn't want to hear this constant screaming and bullying, kind of like the Bill Belichick approach of coaching. And so they were tuning him out. And he particularly had problems with Kevin McHale. Kevin McHale thought he was an orc. And that spring, to the surprise of the NBA world, the Milwaukee Bucks were able to sweep them. And so there was a lot of team dysfunction going on there. Fitch resigned from the coaching position, really kind of forced out. He later went to Houston to coach. And he was replaced by his assistant, Casey Jones, who had played for the Celtics, was a Hall of Fame guard, considered one of the greatest defenders of the 1960s. But that didn't solve another major problem because McHale decided to go the free agency route. And he signed a contract, an offer sheet with the New York Knicks. So this budding Celtics dynasty was about to die on the vine without McHale, one of the members of the Big Three. But Red Auerbach, once again, the genius of Red Auerbach, he came up with a strategy to prevent New York from taking McHale. He basically signed all the New York free agents that were available that year, put them to offer sheets. So he was in a game of chicken. He was daring the New York Knicks. Well, you do want to lose half your team for McHale? The Knicks blinked, and the Celtics were able to swoop in and sign back McHale. In an already busy offseason, Auerbach had another issue because a change of ownership. Harry Mangorian decided to step down, cash out. And one of the leading suitors here for the Celtics was a young Donald Trump, who was trying to expand his sports portfolio. He had already purchased the New Jersey Generals of the United States Football League. And he thought the Celtics would be, an enticing addition to his portfolio. Auerbach, though, shown here on the left, was vehemently opposed to this. He was from New York, after all. He knew all about Donald Trump and his family. In fact, I asked great sports writer for Boston Globe, interviewing him for the book, Dan Shaughnessy, columnist, and he told me there is no way that he would take shit from Donald Trump. So Auerbach had veto power over who the new owner would be. And it turned out it would be the former Gulf and Western CEO, Don Gaston, shown here. So there was a tumultuous ownership change, free agency, coaching change. What else can happen? Well, Auerbach also decided, well, if we're going to be competitive, compete for a title in '84, we need better point guard play. And he traded a backup center, Rick Roby, for future Hall of Famer Dennis Johnson. Once again, Auerbach pulls off a great steal, a literal steal here. And Auerbach, though, he was concerned about the toughness of the team because he thought previous season, they were soft. They were pushed around by other teams. And he felt they needed to get some steel in their spine. So he decides I think he's around 61 years old at this point, an exhibition game against the defending champion Philadelphia 76ers to challenge the Sixers' biggest star, Moses Malone, who stood close to 7 feet tall. He was a walking muscle. And I guess Mr. Malone had roughed up Cedric Maxwell, who was a defensive forward for the Celtics, pretty bad under the boards. So Auerbach, in the middle of the contest, gets out of his seat in the stands, rushes on the court, sticks his finger into Malone's chest, challenging him to a fight. Yeah, well, that's what everyone said. Both benches cleared, and it got pretty ugly. Larry Bird later credited this incident. It was an exhibition game. He said, we won the championship that night, thanks to Red Auerbach. Because now it was a message to the rest of the league, the Celtics are not going to be pushed around anymore. Again, Auerbach was a great psychologist as well. And there was plenty of good news ahead. Celtics finished, 62-20 on the regular season. They were a dominant team. If they had a lead into the fourth quarter, they had a 54-5 record. They were nearly unbeatable at home at Boston Garden. And Bird, once again, proved that he was worth every bit of that record historic rookie contract that he signed with the Celtics back in 1979. He scored about 25 points a game, 10 rebounds, about 7 assists a game. And he also had a lot of steals. He had very quick hands. And although, it's said that, the stereotype, slow white guy, he didn't have a lot of athletic ability. That's a bunch of crack. It's nonsense. He had elite hand-eye coordination, probably better than anyone in the league. And that's why he was able to steal and be able to pass so well, given that hand-eye coordination. And in the playoffs, entering the playoffs that year, they made quick work of most of their opponents, starting with the Washington Bullets, Jeff Ruland here, who was a big guy, but he had very short hands. He looked like a penguin if you saw him play. But the biggest challenge, as it turned out to be in the Eastern Conference, was the New York Knicks. who had what Bird considered the best shooter he had ever seen in his life, Bernard King, who had, or during his career, was almost derailed due to drug abuse. But he recovered and came back and led the Knicks on an improbable run to the playoffs, where they took the Celtics to 7 games. He was, in a way, Michael Jordan before Michael Jordan arrived on the scene. And they went on to, after getting by the Knicks, to meet the Bucks in the Eastern Conference Finals, who had swept them the year before, and they won in 5 games. And I should say about, well, I wanted to include this quote. This is how the New York Times described Mr. King. King is the Eleanor Rigby of pro basketball, wearing a face that he keeps in a jar by the door. Who is it for? To intimidate the opposition with his silent scowl. That was just too good a quote to give up by Mr. George Vesey, who I think won Pulitzer Prize at one point. But of course, the Celtics were not deterred by Mr. King. Cedric Maxwell, whose nickname was Cornbread based on a 1970s movie character, he said, "We're going to stop that bitch." And as it turned out, they did, but it wasn't just Maxwell. They were triple teaming Bernard King. That's how dangerous he was. And he was still getting over 20 points a game. That is a real superstar effort. That's why I said that, at least for this season, he was Michael Jordan before Michael Jordan. Now, heading into the NBA Finals, well, this would be the epic of all finals. And I should note, it wasn't called the Finals in 1984. This is how CBS, this is the title card for it. It was called the NBA World Championship. Doesn't sound as good as the Finals, does it? And so here you had these 2 great historic franchises. And the Lakers were, in many ways, America's team. They were Hollywood, palm trees. And they had all the Hollywood stars, most famously of all, the most famous NBA fan of all, Jack Nicholson here. They were Hollywood cool. And they were led by the great, we're talking great Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who to this day had the most unstoppable shot. No one was able to duplicate it, the skyhook, where he basically shot perpendicular to the hoop. And it would just go over and kind of in a parabola just end up in the basket. It was just an incredible shot. And no one can do it. He was over 7 feet tall. Maybe that had something to do with it. But by 1984, he had already broke the all-time NBA scoring record that had been set earlier by Wilt Chamberlain. And of course, there was Magic Johnson. Kareem was getting up there in years now. He had been in the league since 1970. Magic now was in his 4th year. And he was, the best. I mean, he was better than Bird. Why do I say that? Because he was a point guard. He handled the ball more. Bird was not burdened with kind of running the entire offense. Johnson was, and he could score, he could drive, he could do it all. And so this Lakers team was very formidable. And the Celtics-Lakers, well, what made it so appealing was they were the kind of Ali Frazier of basketball, 2 ancient rivals. And, they had clashed several times in the 50s, late 50s and 60s. I think it was like 7 other times. And the Celtics beat them every time. And the last time was in 1969, Russell's last season, where the Lakers were considered prohibitive favorites. And they had the original Big 3, starting with Jerry West, the great guard, shooting guard. And note this picture. Does that look familiar, that pose? Because that's the NBA logo, what it's based on. It also had, another great player, Elgin Baylor, who was kind of like Dr. J before Dr. J. He would soar over opponents before knee problems kind of sidelined him. And that year, they were able to pick up from Philadelphia Wilt Chamberlain in '69. And it went 7 games, and the Celtics beat them, squeaked by. And when it was all said and done, Auerbach couldn't help but to rub it in to the Lakers, saying, well, where's the great Lakers dynasty, huh? Where is it? I want to see it. And so that didn't go over well in LA, but, that was Auerbach sticking in the needle. He absolutely hated the Lakers. But the Lakers now, with Kareem and Magic, seem more than poised to finally win a NBA championship against the Celtics in the finals. And it was led by Pat Riley, who was kind of the Hollywood handsome, slick back, Gordon Gekko look coach. And it certainly looked like the Lakers were going to take the series, that they'd mop the floor with the Celtics, because in game 1, that's what they literally did. They just blew them off the court in Boston Garden. It wasn't even close. The final score was, I have here, 115-109. That was closer than it actually was. The Lakers were a fast break team. Magic Johnson was one of the greatest outlet passes in the league. And the Celtics, they were more of a half-court team, used their muscle in the paint, rebounding, passing. And so they had trouble adapting to this fast break offense. And they were blown out in a game 1. It was like Wile E. Coyote trying to go against the Roadrunner. And we know how that works. So game 2 was thinking, home court advantage now, because back then they had a 2-2-1-1-1 format. Game 2 was back in the Garden. And, if the Celtics lost this game, series over. You can't come back from, you lost 2 straight home games. It's impossible. So unfortunately for the Celtics, it didn't look so good going down to the closing moments. The Lakers once again shot out to an early lead, but the Celtics painstakingly kind of whittled it back down. And even though the Lakers seemed to have controlled the game at the very end, a errant pass by James Worthy was intercepted by Gerald Henderson, the starting guard for the Celtics. And you heard Johnny Most on the radio, the great Celtics broadcaster, Henderson stole the ball. And, he tied the game, went overtime, and the Celtics won it in overtime. And by the way, on the steal, he was able to drive to the hoop and score. So, Henderson was the unsung hero of the '84 championship. Now, game 3 was back to normal in the sense the Lakers, once again, blew the Celtics away. And this time it was in LA. Game 4, though, this is the game that everyone talks about. And again, the Lakers seemed to be well in control of the situation heading into the third quarter. But before the game started, I think it was in the team shoot-around, Kevin McHale was upset. He didn't like what he was seeing from the Celtics in the previous games. And he says, we can't keep letting them dunk all over us and get those layups, those fast break layups. So McHale said, we got to do something to counteract that. And they're like, well, what are you going to do, big mouth? Okay, I'll show you. And towards the end of the third quarter, as the Laker big man, Kurt Rambis, who's like 6'8", looked like an oversized leprechaun. He was driving to the hoop. He thought he was going to have an easy layup. McHale collared him. That's what he did to him. Just like this. He slammed him down on the hard parquet floor in LA. If McHale had done this on, say, nearby Rodeo Drive, he would have been put in jail. And, this changed the NBA. Because, it was, the NBA was always kind of a rough league, but this, in a championship game, this happens. He almost took his head off. And so both benches are clearing, screaming. Bird and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, of all people, go at it. And Kareem tells Bird, welcome to the NBA in the 1980s. Not the NBA of the 2020s, let's just say. And McHale loved every minute of it because the Celtics were able to come back and win. And he said his only regret from that incident with Rambis, he didn't regret taking him down. He said, I just wish I took down a better player. Coach Riley, though, was not pleased. He basically compared the Celtics to gangsters, the Luca Brazzis of the NBA. Now, game 5, the Lakers were, okay, no matter what, we're going to take it. It was back in Boston. So they go back to Boston. There's all sorts of hype. And at the same time, the nation is paying attention. There's all this drama and, violence. Americans like violence, right? And so everyone's beginning to tune in on the television. And I should note that the NBA was in such bad shape in the late 70s, early 80s, that NBA championship final games were broadcast on tape delay. In Boston, I remember seeing the Lakers Sixers final in 1980. I think it was like on 11:30 at night. That's how the network CBS covered it. That's how they thought of the NBA, how important it was. But now this is prime time, and people are engaged. And so game 5 is, let's see what else they're going to pull here after McHale's thing. But unfortunately for the Lakers, as you can recall, the old garden, the old garden with the obstructed views and everything, it wasn't air conditioned. And there was an early unusual heat wave that spring, that May, and inside the garden was approaching 100 degrees. Now, the Celtics players are more used to this. They would practice in the garden, and they'd play games in the spring, and they'd say like, oh, geez, another Boston, you never know what to expect in Boston. It's either frigid cold or, sauna conditions. So they were kind of acclimated to this. The Lakers were not. And as the game went on, the mercury rose in the garden. And back then, too, it was more acceptable to smoke. So you'd see the smoke kind of rising. And so that's adding to the overall kind of thermal effect here. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and here he is, you can see it, he was actually sucking on oxygen mask here. He was near like passing out. And he was asked after the game, what was it like? Well, can you imagine doing 100 pull-up, push-ups and, in a sauna? And it's just like, it was that ridiculous. And I said, I suggest you go to the local steam bath with all your clothes on to kind of replicate the conditions. But Larry Bird loved it because they were in their backyard. He scored 34 points. He led the way. And this was the kind of the critical win. They were able to get by the Lakers in game 5. And the Lakers had to trudge on back to LA for game 6. And so if the Celtics win this, it's all over. And to their credit, the Lakers did not give up. And, they scored a pretty healthy win over the Celtics, though Bird complained afterwards that the refs favored the Lakers. In fact, he thought the game was fixed. And he blamed David Stern for fixing the game, which Stern vehemently denied because he said they want a game 7 with bigger ratings. Pat Riley said this: Bird is cracking up. So this just lent itself to the drama for this all winner-take-all game 7. And unfortunately, it didn't really live up to the hype. The game started, a young Danny Ainge, who would later become the GM and be the architect of one championship, and really, if you're honest, was the architect of the championship last year. And he drafted Jason Tatum and so forth, Jaylen Brown. He was a guard at this point, starting guard, well, backup guard, I should say. Before the game, he was considered kind of the enfant terrible. He was the guy who liked to stir things up. He went around to all the players in the locker room. He had a stethoscope around his neck, and he'd take them to their heart to measure if they had the heart to win game 7. He got to Cedric Maxwell, the great defensive forward, and he said, I can't find a heartbeat. And, Max is like, damn right you can. And, because Max had the game of his life. He scored over 20 points, crashed the boards, and, defensively, no one could get by him. Maxwell won that championship. And, not Bird, not Parish, not McHale. he had a performance that was better than all three Hall of Famers, including Dennis Johnson, who also became a Hall of Famer. Well, you can hear him today. He does the Celtics radio broadcast. And I think people probably fail to realize, how good a player he was. In many ways, it wasn't a big three on the Celtics of that era. It was a big four with Maxwell. And, he took a line from the Blues Brothers as he went into the game. He said, "I was on a mission from God." He's certainly seen that way. So the Garden erupted. I mean, like you never saw it. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had his goggles stripped from him as he was leaving the court. Not very pleasant. And Bird afterwards admitted, he said, "I can't believe we won this game. Or won the whole series." He said the Lakers had us. They blew it. They gave us the series. He's probably right. And Auerbach said, where's the Lakers dynasty? So again, Auerbach, what a hoot. Now, the NBA, they were delighted because, David Stern, they finally had that content to sell the league. And when they finally did the number crunching, the ratings for the finals, for Game 7, 40 million Americans tuned into that game. 40 million, which was a record basketball audience at that point. And from there on, there was no turning back from the NBA. They had gotten the nation's attention. It was going big time. And it would soon surpass Major League Baseball and go global, just as David Stern had wanted. And the Celtics helped open the door to that because that spring, right after the series, Michael Jordan, as I said earlier, was drafted. And Jordan is going to take it to a whole nother level, make it must-see television. And Kareem, well, he was disappointed. He grew up in New York. He compared it to, once again, the Brooklyn Dodgers trying to get by the New York Yankees. And Pat Riley was just flabbergasted, though he said, we were just out-toughened. And he vowed privately to himself that they would never get out-toughened by the Celtics or any team again. And the Celtics would play them 2 more times and would lose both times. This was the only championship that they won against the Lakers in the 80s. Riley transformed the Lakers into a pretty physically tough team that could stand up to anyone. The Celtics kind of forced him to do that. But there was one last final indignity for the Lakers and Riley. As they got on their VIP bus at Boston Garden to go to their hotel in downtown, fans surrounded the bus and started rocking it and throwing rocks at it. Scary moment. And a lot of the Lakers, glass splattered on them because they broke the windows. It was like the busing crisis, right? And they were frightened. And Magic Johnson was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Got pretty hairy. And so they were terrified. But fortunately, the Boston police, for once, showed up on time. But Larry Bird and the Celtics, they are the story. Although they were never able to beat the Lakers again, at least of this group, they did a more important thing. They launched the modern NBA. And if you're ever wondering why the NBA is so big today, tip your cap to Mr. Bird and the '84 Celtics. Thank you. Supposed to stay here.
Okay, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and I'll get over to you. Okay.
Coincidentally, just a couple of days ago, I finished watching the 30-30 series on the Lakers and the Celtics. And I'm sure that your book complements and supplements that series. But if you're a Celtics fan, it is an absolutely fantastic series. But I thought you might address something that did come up, which is that the Celtics were the whitest team in the NBA. And that was something that was noted by a lot of the black players. And it definitely comes out in the 30-30 series, but I thought you might comment on it as well.
Well, that was the big charge in the 80s, that they deliberately, for marketing purposes, to kind of get the crowds to the Garden, were going out of their way to sign or draft white players. Auerbach always denied this. And given his track record, I'd be willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, he integrated the NBA, first starting five, all black in the league. And, no one, I don't think anyone, named as many black coaches. And in fact, the Celtics were coached by a black man, Casey Jones, kind of inverting the old racial trope and stereotype. So I don't know if that's entirely fair, but I mean, even like people like Will Chamberlain, who did not get along with Red Auerbach, defended him, said that, you can't say that, given his track record. Even Kareem Abdul-Jabbar said, he cast doubt on it. So, but I think, it's something to look into. You have to decide yourself on that, but it's one of those judgment calls, shall we say.
In modern basketball, how has a pointer transformed the game?
It's made it duller. I mean, it's just kind of like you go out there and chuck it, way beyond the line. There's no interior play. And that's why I think, someone like Larry Bird would be an even greater player in this game. He just set up at the 3-point line. He's a great outside shooter and just like, shoot away. Kevin McHale and Robert Parish, not so much. They probably wouldn't have lasted that long. And the way they call the games now, if you just like look at a player, they'll flop, and so it was a much more physical game. But it had a diverse group of styles, like the Lakers had the fast break, and then you go against the Bullets, they were kind of more physical, and so every team had an identity. But now it's just kind of like, because of analytics, I suppose, they feel it's much more economical, more efficient, just to like hoist as many threes as you can. But, it gets boring, monotonous after a while. I don't personally like the NBA. Although I liked the Celtics winning last year, I was appalled by the way they won that championship because they were just a 3-point team.
Tom, could you plug your book?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, you can go to Barnes & Noble, though it's selling well. I think a lot of Barnes & Noble is sold out, but you can order it at Amazon or Barnes & Noble, but Barnes & Noble is the primary character, but there might be some local bookstores as well. I would go on their site or Amazon. You can get copies. You can just order that way. Right now, I talked to my publisher. I think we're going to go into a second or third printing. So, all right by me. And again, I teach politics and history, so this is a nice diversion from all the madness. Sports. But thank you.
Thanks, Tom.